All right. Well, thanks everyone. And we want to welcome Murad Katib, who is the CEO of AGT Foods and the former Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year award winner. And we wanted to bring in Murad to talk about some of his experience through AGT Foods and in a bit of his story. And as well as some of the work that he's done in the community to build partnerships with Indigenous communities. So, Murad, welcome.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Yeah, so I guess we wanted to turn things over to you. I know you have a bit of a presentation to go through, and we're all very eager to. Of course, have our audience engage and learn a bit more about your story.
Great, thanks so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next little while just taking you through a presentation that will kind of give you an idea of where I see the opportunities in the Canada agri-food sector, market outlook, and kind of look at where we're going as a country. And I really want to focus a bit on opportunities for Indigenous communities, participation, and the opportunity at hand. So just to start off, to give you a bit of background on AGT, 2021 was a historical year for our company. We on July the 31st celebrated our 20th anniversary since the day I took a blank sheet of paper in the basement of my home and wrote a business plan to start a value-added processing company focused on lentils, peas, chickpeas, and beans. And so AGT now is a Regina, Saskatchewan headquartered company. We have now 2,500 employees located in 5 continents around the world. And what we do is we originate raw materials from farmers in 5 continents. We process into ingredients, food products, and value-added crops, and we export to 100 countries around the world. So we're about $1.85 billion in sales now, and we're owned actually as a private company now by myself and our management team, and Fairfax Financial Holdings, and the Ontario Pension Program. So, again, a Saskatchewan startup that has really become a multinational company, and Canada has become a very important base for that. So we have global facilities and offices around the world. And but again, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, and we have also canning and packing retail plants in Quebec. I want to just frame the general opportunity for the audience here. And when we look at food production targets, we have to consider, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations is targeting that in the next 40 years, the world must produce the same amount of food that we have produced in the last 10,000 years of civilization. So that really does kind of quantify the challenge at hand as we look at global population growth and rising income growth around the world. So if I look at agri-food market dynamics, we have really 2 major trends that are playing into the agricultural development in Canada. One is that population growth that I mentioned, 9.7 billion people by 2050, creating that food demand that will equate to the production of the last 10,000 years. But another very important factor in this is the growth and rising incomes of middle-income consumers in Asia and in emerging markets around the world, estimated at $33 trillion in Asia alone by 2030. So that kind of gives you a dual-faceted opportunity of population growth and income growth. And let's layer on one more dynamic onto that, which is really the growth of health, nutrition awareness, and the desire for sustainable agricultural products. The new consumer of the future is very concerned about water. They're very concerned about our environment, greenhouse gases, land and soil management, nutrient management, soil mass management. I mean, all of these things are very important, not only to those who consider themselves environmentalists, but those who just consider themselves socially conscious and aware consumers. So if we look at pulses in sustainable agriculture, pulse crops are what we call lentils, peas, chickpeas, and beans. very important crop in Western Canada. So when I started the company 20 years ago, it was a minor crop. It was just being grown by, let's say, a million or two of acres. And, one of the major opportunities in pulses was when I was a kid growing up in Davidson, Saskatchewan, a small rural community of 1,200 people, every third field was summer fallow. And summer fallow is the black dirt soil that, we would leave, to replenish the soil naturally in soil management. Well, instead of leaving summer fallow, we had an opportunity where legumes, pulses, lentils, chickpeas, peas, and beans naturally fix nitrogen in the soil. And so as a result of us growing cereal crops and canola oil seeds, we needed a third crop in the rotation, and pulses, being plant nitrogen fixing, lead to a lower energy requirement. And when we look at water use efficiency, pulses are very efficient on a per unit of protein. So if we look at, for instance, a plant-based protein of pulses consumes about 43 gallons of water per kilogram of plant protein, which is a very efficient ratio, compared to more traditional protein sources. Now, that doesn't mean that more traditional protein sources are not still highly in demand and aren't making incredible gains in environmental sustainability. Like our beef industry and our dairy industry in Canada have made quantum leaps in sustainability. So in general, I think what I wanted to say is sustainable agriculture is really an important element of what we need to look at. And, I have another slide you can see here, which is a carbon footprint slide, kind of showing that, plant-based proteins are on the far left in terms of carbon footprint, and some more traditional, protein sources are more on the right. So, there is definitely a spectrum of carbon footprint, a spectrum of consumer demand for each of these products, but, certainly an opportunity. Now, when I want to look at Canada as a country, I really want to look at, our assets and our liabilities. So let's start with our assets. Why is Canada a global agri-food partner for the world? Well, we're very blessed with, the two most scarce resources in the world today: land and fresh water. So fresh water with long coastlines suited to aquaculture, least densely occupied arable land in the world, is definitely one of Canada's, major opportunities, in terms of our agricultural sector going forward. So, this gives us certainly an opportunity when we look at growth of our sector. We have, in addition to that, early adopters of technology. For our farmers, our producers are very innovative. We have strong research organizations. We do have a policy environment that has actually been quite, predictable in terms of the opportunity in agriculture. We have stable governments, a stable financial system. So these are all, very, very important elements, of the overall development. And when we look at barriers to growth, though, in Canadian agriculture, we really have a very low conversion of commodity into value-added products. We have an overall relatively low productivity. And so, when we look at economies of scale in farms and, productivity enhancing technologies, have been really limited in our country because of rural broadband access. If I look at the overall access of the agriculture sector, it's actually quite positive compared to the access that we see in Indigenous communities and in rural and remote areas of our country, where rural broadband access is actually a major constraint to the development of multiple sectors of our economy. We have a lot of trade barriers, in terms of lack of preferential trade agreements. We do have the Europe Trade Agreement now that needs to be fully implemented. And in general, we have a very strong regulatory burden. And I want to also, kind of draw attention to the fact that we haven't done well with underrepresented and underutilized populations. So Indigenous communities and Indigenous participation, youth, women have all been dramatically underutilized in the development of the agriculture sector. So that actually, on the barriers, really creates what I consider to be opportunities. Technology and innovation are going to be major drivers of the sector as we go forward. So, the ability to use that rural broadband access to deploy sensors, data collection, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things. So, a collection of sensors and data collection mechanisms, drones. Today we go out to fields and we measure, a square meter of a field, and we count plants and count pods. Drones will scan fields and be able to take resolution images that will then be able to be analyzed, and yield predictions will become very, very precise. These are all technologies that ultimately can be used for identity preservation, traceability, food safety, and ultimately be certified by things like blockchain. So, all of these things are very exciting parts of agriculture. So when I look at Canada, I really see us as the first stop on the protein highway. And when you look up at the sky and you look at the frame on the right of my slide and you see the clouds in the sky, I want you to see the world. And I want you to realize that emerging economies' demand for protein is growing rapidly. And that growth of protein consumption is going to create a big opportunity for Canada. So Canadian ingredients and food have a very high quality and a clean reputation. And I think that that's going to be also another opportunity for us to be very, very competitive. When I look at my next slide, plant-based foods, fuels, and biomass, this is where the agriculture sector is heading, where plant-based foods, so we're going to be continuing to grow crops like lentils and peas and durum wheat and canola, and we're going to be using the protein extracted from canola to feed a growing aquaculture industry, where canola protein can be used to replace fish meal in salmon and shrimp production in farmed seafood applications. We're going to be seeing lentils and peas and chickpeas used in plant-based meat analogs and crunchy, delicious snacks and bakery foods that are gluten-free. And we're going to continue to see durum wheat and pulses blended together in snacks and pastas that are going to be completely digestible proteins as we go forward. And the canola fields of Saskatchewan and the canola fields of Alberta and Manitoba are synonymous with the Saudi Arabian oil fields that renew annually, that allow us to take canola and produce completely renewable diesel fuel to be run in the tractors that produce the canola, to be run in the locomotives that transport our crops to market, and to provide sustainable aviation fuel that will run the planes of the future on 100% canola-based biodiesel. So these are very exciting transformational opportunities. And the biomass of our agricultural sector, like wheat straw, will be used for pulp and paper alternatives. And flax straw will be used as a heat source for renewable fuel requirements for heating units around the world. These are, again, exciting opportunities as we look forward. Now, my next slide is talking about bulk handling, rail, and terminal facilities. And my company, AGT, has actually taken a very solid view that logistical control is a critical element of the success of any business. And, we've done a number of projects, including short-line railway development in Saskatchewan and container handling development in Saskatchewan, where we own a container terminal, and rail consolidation and cleaning and processing facilities. So my Saskatchewan investments totaled over $150 million over the last 3 years. And we were also involved in a very historical project for First Nations and Indigenous communities in northern Manitoba, which was the acquisition, the remediation, and the fixing of the Hudson Bay Railway. And so that was a project I was very proud to be the chair of the Arctic Gateway Group for 2.5 years, where we were able to very successfully acquire that railway, fix 29 washouts between Gillam and Churchill. We were able to partner with the Indigenous and First Nations communities in northern Manitoba, along with the municipalities and other communities. And we were able to put in place a safe, efficient railway system that reconnected those communities, that ultimately provided freight options for general merchandise. We restarted grain shipments out of the Port of Churchill, and we were able to put in safety management systems, environmental management systems, professional development of the staff there. And I'm proud to say that 84% of the hires on the Hudson Bay Railway during our tenure were Indigenous employees. So, ultimately, those are the kind of projects that show the key critical connectivity of infrastructure and community and economic development. And, ultimately, when we look at that type of project, we're very proud also to be able to hand it over to the leaders of the First Nations communities who are our partners for the first 100% First Nations and community-owned railway system running, in Canada. So very, excellent project, and one that the government of Canada has agreed to continue with a new $40 million investment. So these are, what I would call reconciliation and economic development integrated in action. So it's not just words, it's actually projects that are going to deliver prosperity to communities as we connect and as we develop the economy and the resource economy in Western Canada. If you look at the Western Canadian growing region and our strategy at AGT Foods, you can see all the red dots on the slide and our railway systems, right in the middle of the growing regions. And I wanted to also give you on the next slide a bit of a operations overview of the grain system in Western Canada. Where you do have producers, you have, processing plants and handling infrastructure that can either go into containers or it can go into bulk vessels. And I think that, there's a very important opportunity where this value chain of agriculture in Western Canada provides link opportunities for Indigenous participation at each link in the chain. So we are predicting, a very strong and robust opportunity for First Nations groups to become landowners and producers, to own primary processing and handling facilities, to be able to then supply into bulk vessel programs and into containerized export programs around the world, as we look at the development and really participate in food processing. The next slide just kind of shows a bit about how I look at transportation. And you can see my railways again and even how they interact with large generational projects like the Lake Diefenbaker irrigation project that's planned in Saskatchewan, which will be approximately $4 to $5 billion of investment. Our railways will be a very important element of allowing those areas to be connected to world markets so those high value crops can get into the market. And, again, I mentioned this kind of a transportation hub concept. We've actually built in Delisle, Saskatchewan, near Saskatoon, a 1,200 tons per hour processing facility that takes all our railway operations and all of those rail cars. If you've ever seen the Saskatchewan flagged rail cars going across our country, we now own that entire fleet. That was the Saskatchewan government fleet, and AGT bought that fleet and put it into our processing operations. So as I look forward to opportunities, there's a lot of changes in the food systems in the world. Agricultural commodities are changing in how they're marketed. Consumers demanding convenience foods, emerging markets, economies growing, gives us that profile of growth and opportunity where we can take primary production, convert into ingredients, and we can supply to the world. So the case study is what we did in Pulses. So Pulses and food trends. Consumer trends are that protein has a positive image. Clean label food products have an image. And food companies are going towards high protein, high fiber, non-GM, opportunities. And, from that perspective, ingredients derived from plants are growing. So we look at that, plant-based versus vegan. So vegan is a really extreme type, vegetarianism. But a plant-based preference is a lifestyle choice. It's a flexitarian lifestyle. We're seeing that being a major consumer trend where people aren't wanting to be vegetarians. They're wanting to balance out their diet, and they're wanting to do what the Canada Food Guide tells us to do, which is to substitute some plant-based alternatives to be able to offer yourself more diversity, more complete micronutrients, a better balance of both fat, cholesterol, and other nutritional factors. So where are pulse ingredients being used, and what are we doing in our business? We're actually taking these pulses now, we're grinding them into flours, we're separating protein, starches, fibers, and fractions, and we're making snack foods, meat analogs, batters and breadings for the fried foods that people eat. We're making veggie pasta today, which is being marketed around the world as a yellow pea-based alternative to durum pasta. Pet foods, non-dairy milks are being marketed with peas and lentils and faba beans and chickpeas. So these, again, are very interesting developments. And if you look at pulse ingredient processing, it's what I said. Take that whole product and break it down into its components. We do that all naturally. No additives except water and air, heat. We don't add any chemicals. We don't add any other accelerants. We entirely mechanically separate the components, and we market those fractions to the various food companies. So our innovation pipeline, driven by things like the protein supercluster called Protein Industries Canada, and the funding we've received from that, is in the development of what we call texturized pulse protein. And that is actually chunk strips and granules of plant-based material that are extruded into a shape, and then they're actually formed into things like burgers, nuggets, ground, and meatballs. So that's been, again, texturized pulse protein as a meat alternative is a big growing area. You've all heard of Beyond Meats and Impossible Foods and Maple Leaf Light Life platforms. These are all companies that are very active in this. The next slide shows you veggie pasta and veggie crumb. So veggie crumb is launching in Loblaws now across the country, so you'll be able to buy it at superstores and No Frills and Maxi stores across the country. That veggie crumb is a yellow pea-based breadcrumb replacement. And veggie pasta, again, in stores around the country, coming very, very soon. Big national brands are launching as well. Kashi Go is a new launch that we worked on with a keto-friendly cereal, and Kashi Go using yellow peas and chickpeas and others. And on the next slide, you can see snacks, non-dairy foods, crackers, chips. All of those things are really, really important. So as I get kind of into a conclusion side of this, it's a big opportunity. We all know that. But we need to get our act together in terms of an economic strategy. And so Canada's economic strategy tables, I was very fortunate and honored to be asked by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Agriculture and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology to lead the agri-food economic strategy table for our country. And I had a broad, diverse group of stakeholders who sat on that table back in 2017 as a part of the budget, and we were able to table our recommendations in 2017 and 2018, to the government, to give them a little bit of guidance and direction on how we thought the agri-food sector could play out. And when we look at, the overall opportunity, our priority themes came out as, agile regulatory system, infrastructure, meaning both physical trade infrastructure, but also a very strong focus on digital broadband infrastructure. We needed to ensure that we had a diverse labor force. So it's all about skills training, and it's about encouraging the participation of communities that have been underrepresented. And First Nations and Indigenous communities are a great source of potential growth for our sector. And so again, there's not only a role, but an opportunity, not only for the communities to benefit, but for the industry as a whole to benefit from a young, diverse workforce, as we continue to grow our sector. We need to, have that, market access, into key markets around the world. These are all kind of key recommendations that we had. So that work was, concluded, and then we hit the COVID pandemic, and the government decided to, take a look and renew some of the work of the strategy tables by forming what they called the Industry Strategy Council. And that was formed in 2020, around June of 2020, and Monique Leroux out of Quebec was asked to chair the committee. And then 9 industry strategy table chairs were invited to be participants as a part of the Industry Strategy Council. I was one of the 2 original 6 strategy table chairs that was asked back to continue my role as the chair of Agri-Food, and I was joined by a extremely talented group of Canadians, including some very interesting people from the oil and gas, advanced manufacturing, health and biosciences, and transportation industries, to name a few. So that report was also tabled back in late 2020. And, I'm very happy to say that as I look back now on the work that we did to kind of define what will Canada look like in a post-COVID economic environment, we were very clear to say it's not about just reacting to the pandemic. It's about taking this to be an opportunity to form an industrial strategy for our country. And I call it Agriculture 2.0. And an Agriculture 2.0 is a key element of the economic growth strategy of our country. So, one of the things that we recommended was planned trade corridors and gateways and digital infrastructure. And I'm happy to say that in budget 2021, there was an endowment of $1.4 billion into the National Trade Corridors Fund. The digital infrastructure rollout of rural broadband was accelerated with targets advancing from 2029 to 2026. There was, again, agile regulations, contained within the budget with regulatory mandates to streamline regulations in a post-COVID economic environment. There was a lot of, focus put on skills and reskills workforce, and the recognition of opportunities for underrepresented groups such as women, youth, and First Nations, as I mentioned earlier. When we look at agriculture, we were very vocal to say we need to have initiatives like what I call 25 by 25. We want to ensure that of new crops like pulses, that 25% of our production is domestically processed into ingredients and not just shipped as commodities. That will create value added opportunities, in our particular jurisdictions. So, these were all broad recommendations, that again, I think there's a lot of traction and a lot of opportunity as we look forward to implementing those recommendations. Now, when I turn around and go, to where I think the opportunity is now for Indigenous ag innovation and participation, let's look at particular areas of constraint. When we look at the research around Indigenous participation, access to land, capital, and suitable infrastructure, is listed as a very severe barrier for the participation of the sector. So that would include, access to land, in terms of both treaty entitlement lands, capital access that's constrained by, collateralization of loans and, ownership structures of land, and really suitable infrastructure. When we look at what I did in the Hudson Bay Railway context, we don't have suitable roads, rail, and we certainly don't have suitable digital broadband for full participation of entrepreneurs and of Indigenous participation in agriculture. Food insecurity is a major constraint. So I think that creates the opportunity to develop local food choices to bolster food availability in Indigenous communities, and then scale those into regional and interregional and international exports. So, what I would like to see as a vision for 20 years forward is that Indigenous communities develop local production schemes, they feed locally, and then they scale and grow to exports and to other markets as they continue to scale those operations. Skilled and reskilled workforce, there's a recognition of opportunities for underrepresented communities, as I said. So agriculture has a key role to play in combating, the opportunity, in combating, what I would call systemic racism and class distinction in the Canadian economy. And so, when we look at that kind of systemic racism, it's actually kind of institutionalized by the fact that we're underinvested in so many of the areas that I mentioned when it comes to Indigenous communities. So when I look at renewing and expanding programs, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada had the Indigenous Agriculture and Food Systems Initiative. I thought it was a great initiative in terms of the way it was focused. So I read here it's to increase economic development opportunities of Indigenous peoples and communities in Canada. The initiative will support Indigenous communities and entrepreneurs who are ready to launch agriculture and food system projects. This project was actually oversubscribed. So it tells you that it was really hitting the mark. Excuse me. So when I look at, concluding off on the opportunities and where I see, opportunities to grow, aquaculture is a major opportunity for Indigenous participation. Farmed salmon and shrimp production growth is in the double digits in North America and in Europe. And, there's an opportunity, again, when you look at sustainable farming practices and, freshwater aquaculture in Saskatchewan, this creates a big opportunity. Now, that will link into opportunities that we see in the plant-based crops and food sectors as, byproducts from processing that we're planning to be doing on these crops will be very suitable for aquaculture feed operations. For instance, as I mentioned earlier, canola protein for fish meal and aquaculture, pea starch as a low micro wheat flour replacement, and non-GMO pulses as feed for the livestock and aquaculture sectors. So the connectivity of processing gives an opportunity for Indigenous communities to be really looking at these sectors. There's been a defined niche market for Indigenous plants, untapped potential of land resources currently being leased to non-First Nations farmers. There's an opportunity, and we're seeing some of the bands in Saskatchewan and other jurisdictions taking that land back and starting farming operations. Now, I think that it really doesn't just look at the fact that there's a large population interested in seizing the economic opportunity. We've got to look, in addition to just setting up standalone operations, that there's opportunities within the supply chain of players established. So our company, Viterra, Cargill, Richardson, there's trucking opportunities. There's trades that are servicing our factories and our grain handling facilities. There's employment opportunities for First Nations youth. When we look at that, we have to work with our educational institutions to match the needs of the ag sector. In Saskatchewan, we see active initiatives with Saskatchewan Institute of Indian Technologies, First Nations University, Polytech, and the broader university context. We see natural, clean label foods trend playing into a local and Indigenous and clean brand strategy that we believe has great potential in not only North America, but, again, when you look at, that environmentally conscious and socially aware consumer, a local, Indigenous, and clean food label, could have some great potential for niche markets and beyond. So to conclude, it's a race. So when we look at, the natural partner for agri-food, Canada is in a good position. We have a good coach. We have a good lane in the race. We've trained hard. We've tested negative for anabolic steroids, so we're all clean and ready to go. Canada has a strong brand. The fundamental demand and growth is there. We have a good policy environment. And I believe that companies and economies that can develop value chains and ones that have companies and participants that play in multiple links in that value chain are going to be very, very successful. So as I kind of conclude, what I want to say to our audience today is the opportunity is generational. The opportunity is large. Be focused. Realize that feeding the world is a noble cause, and there is an opportunity for you in there. Reach into your entrepreneurial spirit, grab it, get some help around you, and good luck. Thank you.
Thanks, Murad. I just want to thank you again for all of the hard work that you've been doing in your organization and how you're seeing the opportunities that are forthcoming for Indigenous communities across Canada. And I think the whole purpose of us coming together for this conference was we, as a development corporation, as an Indigenous development corporation, we wanted to see how we can begin working with the ag sector, very similar to what we're doing in the mining sector, and the oil and gas sector. I mean, there's partnerships, there's relationships that are built, there's policy, and so there's a lot of engagement that happens in those sectors. And so, what we're exploring is, well, how do we start to do this in the ag sector? And I think all of the work that you've been doing and the conversations that you have and the leadership you've taken, even with our own governments, are all foundational in how we build these relationships and create opportunity. And one of the other things is we want to be able to see our nations not just be the producers, but what are those other opportunities? And I think, AGT creates a lot of great opportunity for us to think about, well, how else can we invest? Besides, farming operations in our communities, which I'm from a farming family. So, I get quite excited when, I do share with my grandfather that, we are going to make strides in the ag sector through our company. Except
Yeah, to make a comment on that, some of the things I didn't touch on, because with limited time, but when I look at the local food systems and that opportunity for communities to become engaged in agriculture, it can play multiple roles in the strategy of development. I mean, that food insecurity is a big portion of the problem that we're seeing in communities as well. So an ability to raise food, whether it be greenhouses, vertical agriculture, intensive agriculture in closed spaces, micro agricultural systems, maybe you're producing fruits and vegetables for your own communities and you're supplying to Loblaws or Federated Co-op at the same time. So, you get to kind of kill two birds with one stone, and it really creates that opportunity for scaling. I think that's the exciting. It's beyond just being a commodity producer and that's it. And then I also want to say to the youth out there, technology in agriculture is a massively big opportunity. So if you're interested in computer programming, artificial intelligence, machine learning, the Internet of Things, go get your training and think of agriculture, because that's where it's going to be at.
Absolutely. Those are the things that we want to be able to ensure our nations are focusing on well into the future. I have my kids in a computer science camp right now. They're doing coding, so I'm preparing them for the future, and we need to continue to do that for our Indigenous youth that are growing up in our education system. Murad, one of the things that I'm curious about now, we look at the partnerships that you've created in Manitoba and future partnerships that you may create with Indigenous communities. And what I'm curious about is how do we start to get other organizations to think about partnership with Indigenous communities? How do we get them to open up the calls to action and TRC, and start to think about, well, how can we begin to do something today that can, lead to future investment or participation of Indigenous communities in the ag sector?
Yeah, look, I think that, ultimately the approach we've always taken is, community development is foundational in the work that we do in agricultural communities. So we've been in the rural sectors, and, we kind of took that similar approach when we went to Manitoba on the infrastructure side, on the transportation side. It wasn't about just partnering and, just cutting a check and feeling good that we could say that they were partners. It was about looking at how it truly actually affected the communities and what the future would hold if we could succeed in improving that infrastructure. So, the gone, I think, are the days. And if we look at the successful projects in mining and oil and gas, it's gone are the days that, exploitive resource development are just, paying to partner. We've got to recognize that opportunities for true collaboration today are an economic partnership that are going to have to last for generations. And that's the way you've got to approach the business. It's got to be a true partnership, not just a collaboration. And I think that that's where the opportunity exists in agriculture, where, again, the development of the sector is going to be at a very big pace over the next 20 years. The opportunities are endless. And if it is a race, we need everybody to come in together. So I look at, workforce as a big opportunity. I mean, without, Indigenous participation and our ability to truly influence, Indigenous youth to consider agriculture as a career, we're going to have skill shortages, even worse than we have today. So, it's a win-win-win, Thomas. That's the way I think that the ag sector looks. It's renewable too. So once we have the land and we do the management properly, it will truly give for generations to come.
appreciate, the work that AGT has done in, research and sharing best practices in how we manage our farms sustainably. I mean, that's, at the core of a lot of our organizations as Indigenous development corporations is sustainability. How do we make sure that we're balancing the work that we're doing or the resources that we may be extracting with good practices that will ensure that the land is protected for generations to come, because we always think of 7 generations ahead. What are we going to leave for our future generations, 7 generations ahead? And I think through some of the work that you're doing in sustainable farming and best practices, I think those are really key and critical opportunities for not only our communities to learn, but the ag sector in general. And so one of the questions I would have around that is, how do we begin to introduce our nations to these types of practices, knowing that we do have quite a number of nations in Saskatchewan right now that are moving towards farming operations. How do we make sure, and I think I was shared this bit of information at one point, was, some of our communities are starting to forget the process of farming because they've done it for so long. But, of course, our future generations are a bit disconnected. But one of the things that was shared with me was, that's perfectly fine. There's actually better ways that we need to look at farming. I think, how do we create those opportunities between what you're doing with AGT and with our nations?
Well, I think that fundamentally the biggest positive influence on the outcome, Thomas, is going to be that consumers are driving this demand. So this isn't just feel-good sustainability. What I love is economically grounded, sound management. That's what this is going to be all about. It is a consumer imperative to be able to manage the sustainability, the water use, and the soil and the land. And so that is so consistent with the cultural and the desire of Indigenous communities that I think that's what kind of solidifies the partnership. And, when we look at, essential elements of life, my actual background is I was born in Davidson, Saskatchewan, but I'm of Turkish origin. And, it's interesting, if we look at the historical, basis of the Turkish people and many Indigenous people, they say that the roots of our communities all originated in the same places in Asia. And, I'm going to tell you a very interesting anecdote. I did my master's degree in Arizona, and there's a very famous lake, Lake Havasu in Arizona. And I asked, again, an Indigenous leader in Arizona once, about that, because I was quite curious. And he explained to me that Hava is air and Su is water. And these were 2 essential elements of life in their culture. Well, I want to tell you, in Turkish, Hava is air and Su is water. So those words still are in our language today. So, when I look at this sustainability of agriculture, the consumer driving this trend will bring together like-minded groups and individuals. Those are the ones who are going to succeed ultimately to meet that consumer demand. That's why I'm so optimistic about our opportunity in Indigenous participation, because the cultural alignment is so strong that it just makes sense.
Absolutely. One of the things that, one of the other areas I think that, we need to do a bit more work. And I know you touched on some of the federal programs that were set up for Indigenous investment and of course, the oversubscription of those opportunities. How do we begin to take a seat at that table as Indigenous communities to be able to, look at new funding opportunities or programming opportunities that, we can use in alignment with the industry. And so, let's bring everyone around the table and say, let's map this out. Let's figure out how, we strategically provide funding through these programs so that Indigenous communities can, not slowly integrate into this, but actually leap into the industry. because that's, our vision as an organization, and why we've spent a great deal of time on strategy, and we have a specific ag investment strategy that we're looking to deploy. But it's about building the foundation around the sector first, so that we know that we can have some success, or some very early success, and that we can begin paving a way for other nations to be able to think about investing in other ways in the ag sector. So I think, the question here would be, how do we get, strong allies like yourself, Murad, to help us get to those tables, and be able to fully engage with some of the ideas that we may have as Indigenous nations, but also what the sector is looking for in terms of opportunity to engage with Indigenous communities.
Well, look, I think that, there's a general recognition, and I used, very strong terms in my presentation, like systemic racism and class distinction. I mean, ultimately, in our economy today, the deck is stacked against certain groups participating. And there's a recognition that we need to combat this, but what's the roadmap to doing that? And I think that, again, agriculture provides such a solid foundational value chain that, when I look at the production of fruits, vegetables, meat, crops, and aquaculture, these are all areas that have not only massive potential for local, regional, and international markets, but they have, participation opportunities in terms of scaling. So, what we've got to do is continue to articulate that the strategy is there. And if the governments want to truly tackle this participation issue and that gap of participation and economic return, they do have to continue with very material targeted programs to encourage partnerships. And, again, whether it be, Canadian companies like myself being encouraged to have Indigenous partners, in the commercialization of ventures and having certain benefits for doing so, there would be an ultimate, collaboration effect, Thomas, over time, where we would help to raise the capacity of the Indigenous partners to scale their businesses as they continue to go, and they'd fit into our value chains. I'm a firm believer in clusters. I'm a firm believer in larger companies building value chains that smaller companies can participate in. And that's, where I'm hoping that things like initiatives that we're doing in Regina, the Ag and Food Hub strategy, that, I know, Thomas, you guys are involved in that strategy with us. The Regina region clustering as a plant-based food, biomass, and renewable fuel center for Canadian processing excellence is going to create opportunities for communities around. So we got to get government to get serious about putting money where their mouth is into targeted programs, and then encouraging private capital to partner with that capital to really develop real businesses. And I think that government's there. The strategy set forward, and agriculture has been foundational in the last budget. There's a recognition that it is a super cycle, not insulated, but we're certainly a super cycle resilient economic growth sector. Again, we don't boom and bust like oil and gas does. We're renewable. What more do I need to say? I mean, that's the type of opportunity that can grow and scale.
Yeah, Murad, one of the really interesting things that we try to educate a lot of our governments and customers in the market is around economic impact. And when you look at the business model that a lot of First Nations development corporations have incorporated over the years and have built out, it's different in that the impact is greater. And it's because of the business models that we have. We choose as nations to take care of our community. And so we heavily invest in the skills of our employees and our organizations. We are, investing in community capacity building with our youth through, different types of programs to ensure that our youth are identifying opportunities, well into the future with our organizations. And then we continuously reinvest any profits that we make from our organizations or our businesses, and we buy more companies, and or we're investing into newer opportunities that in other sectors to help us diversify and create future opportunity for our youth. And some of the interesting statistics around the economics of some of our business models. The investment of an organization like our development corporation of earning a contract in our economies, it's 2.5% goes back into the economy. So for every $100,000 contract we get, $250,000 goes back as economic impact to our local provincial governments. And that's an opportunity that I think we often miss in the economics. And so we look at the diversity into these other sectors, and especially the ag sector. We can start to see those additional returns. So those investments that are being made from government, you're getting those back in almost 3 times what you're investing in the community. And I think by strategically having
listen, this is the thing that I think that people have to recognize that. I did some work recently with the Women Entrepreneurs of Saskatchewan. So a very similar thing where we were identifying barriers to growth of women-owned businesses. Very similar to what we'd see in Indigenous businesses. The economic business case for full participation moves the GDP needle in our country by full percentage points. So this is not a charity thing that we should do because it's socially the right thing to do. Indigenous participation in our sectors, women's participation in our sectors, and proper youth engagement will lead to a growth in the standard of living of our country, period. So that's the economic case. So again, I feel good about the fact that we're encouraging it, we're working towards it, but it's all about return. And we can get that at the same time as doing good. Isn't that the best case scenario?
Murad, I sure appreciate the leadership that you have in this space. And I definitely look forward to working with you and AGT Foods, and continuing the good fight in the sector, and look forward to having this conversation with you again at some point in the future, and hopefully we've moved that mark. So I want to thank you again for participating in the Indigenous Ag Innovation Conference, and wish you all the best.
Thanks very much for having me. Good luck, everyone.